Hey everybody, welcome to this, my second of two videos on the KMZ Zenit-C. In this video, we talked in the first video about what everything on the camera is. In this video, we're going to talk about what everything does. So, first thing we're going to do is we're going to mount and unmount the lenses. Now, this has an M39, or is it M42? That looks like an M39 mount. However, the flange focal distance for this camera is specific to this camera. So even though I believe that Leica lenses will thread on this, they will not reach infinity focus. They'll only be macro lenses. So if you're going to get one of these cameras, just bear in mind that if it doesn't come with a lens, you have to make sure to pair it with the correct flange focal distance. And the Wikipedia article has a whole lot more information about this specific lens mount and how to identify the lenses for it. So to unmount the lenses, you simply unscrew them counterclockwise. To mount them, then you're just going to screw it counterclockwise. You're going to get the threads into the raceways, and it should thread on very easily. If it doesn't thread on easily, then back it out and start again, because you don't want to cross-thread the lens. And that's it. That's how you change the lenses. All right, next let's load film into this camera. Now, annoyingly, this has the Leica style of leader requirement. So I've already done it because I don't have a scissors with me right now. But at any rate, what you've got to do is take your normal piece of 35mm film and cut an extra long skinny part in front of it. And what you can do is just take a scissors and cut along that natural line that was already cut into the leader, just a little bit back, and then cut a curve. It has to be a gentle curve up this way. You don't want to have any hitches in here that can get caught inside the camera and tear the film, because then you'll have to recut it. And as far as length goes, you can see it's just a little bit longer than a finger. So probably about 3 inches, give or take, you need to take off of it. To load the film, we're going to go to OTKP, open up the film back. Next, we take out this spool. We're going to, is that correct? I always get confused about which way is correct with these, because taking them out of the camera is such an abnormal thing. Let's see, that doesn't look correct. Is it? No, maybe it is. Yeah, that's got to be it. Okay. Pull up some of the slack here. Next, we're going to go into the camera. I'm going to drop the 35mm cassette in there, pulling tension back into the cassette as needed. Drop both of these in there. Now you know you have done it correctly if you can see the emulsion, which is sort of the duller side, facing the lens when you load it. So now we know that's incorrectly. We're going to put the bottom back on somehow. There we go. Okay. And advance the film. Now, since we're just advancing the film right now, what we're going to do is I'm going to set the shutter to bulb. And let's take a look inside of the camera. So you can see there, the film has got just the start of the leader curve showing. So if you've never loaded a camera this way before, I recommend putting it in bulb and looking at the shape of the film as you're loading it. Now we're going to advance. And we'll do this again and see if the film has moved. And it has. So now the film is taking up the entire space. So we know that it's being taken up correctly. If you just try to use standard 35mm film that you could buy today and load it, it will not load properly. You do have to cut that shape into the film in order for it to be taken up properly by this camera. So there we go. We've now loaded the film. We've advanced it a couple of frames. We know that it's set correctly. So we're going to adjust this dial to 0 or 1, whichever your preference is. Dealer's choice on that one. Set it to 1 because we're on the first frame here. And that's it. So there is no ISO dial that you have to use with this camera. One thing that I like to do with cameras like this that don't have an ISO dial, that don't have a memo dial, is I'll take a piece of frog tape, which is that green tape, here we go, that adheres to things well and can be removed very cleanly, or masking tape or painter's tape, those work too. Frog tape tends to leave the least residue and also not peel up any paint or coatings on your camera. And then just write the film type on it. Or if you are going to carry this around your waist and you're worried about the frog tape getting peeled off by your belt or shirt, stick it on the bottom. I do that a lot too. So that's a really good way to keep track of the type of film that you've got inside of your camera. So when you are using your camera, you're going to go through your day, you're going to take all of your shots. Once you reach the end of your roll, you're going to rewind it. And to do that, you push down on this collar around the shutter button. It'll trigger the shutter, and now you just start rewinding. Or I think you can pull this out. Not on this one, you can't anyway. If you really want to go and rewind it quickly, what you do is you rotate the knob and the camera at the same time. Once you get done with the rewinding, you pull the film out. I'm going to leave a little bit of a leader because I need to use this film again. But in reality, what you would do is you would rewind it until the entire leader was taken back into the film. That would prevent you from accidentally reusing this film and ruining both all of your shots with having accidental double exposures. If you're done for the day, simply, oops, wrong side, pop that cassette back in, the cassette take-up spool back in, pop the bottom back on, or if you're not done for the day, put your next roll of film in, and there you go. And that is how you load and unload film from the camera. All right, next thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to use a flash on this camera, because this is a very, very strange system, okay? There is this little doodad around here. And if you look in that window right in front of my fingertip, that is the millisecond delay for your flash. Now, if you are using a flash today, any sort of flash you're going to use is what's called an X flash, a xenon flash. It's a non-bulb flash, meaning you don't replace the bulb after each use. So this can use those modern flashes. What you want to do is set your delay to 0. So unless you are using bulb flashes, which you are not likely to do, just set this to 0 and leave it there. And then anytime you want to use the flash, oops, there we go. Just make sure that your shutter speed is set to 1/25th of a second. And when you take your picture at 1/25th with this at 0, your flash will sync correctly. So why is that? It's because of the way that the flash on focal plane shutters work. The shutter curtains and the shutter speeds are not controlled by the speed of the curtain, right? What happens is when you take a picture, the first curtain opens, travels, and then the second curtain closes, and then when you advance the film, it rearms them and resets the curtains. That's what the camera does. At 1/25th of a second, the first curtain opens, and when it reaches the end of its travel, all of the film is exposed to light for slightly less than 1/25th of a second, and at that moment, the flash triggers. And then the second curtain closes, and then the process repeats when you rearm the shutter. So if you're at 1 full second, or bulb it would be, the first curtain opens, you hold the shutter down for a second, but at that time that first curtain has finished its travel, the flash would fire. And then whenever you're done with your bulb exposure, the second curtain closes, and then you advance the film. Great, so what about 1/250th of a second? Well, that first curtain would open, and then that second curtain would come in behind it. When that first curtain finishes its travel, then the flash fires. And so what would happen is what's between the curtains would be illuminated. What's behind the second curtain would be blank because the second curtain would block the light from the flash from reaching the film. So if you're going to use a flash, it has that very, very slow sync speed of 1/25th of a second, which means for daylight film flash, you've basically got to be using the slowest film stocks on the market with this camera. But as a baseline, this camera was really designed for very slow films in the 10 to 50 ISO range. You're not going to be using 400 ISO film with this camera unless you're shooting indoors. Next thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about what's on the lens here, because what's on the lens with cameras like this is a little bit more important for taking a photo than with many other types of lenses. So this is how we're going to rack the focus. It has almost a full 360 degrees of focus rack. This is its closest focus point, and this is infinity right over here. So that's a huge amount of focus accuracy. Then on the front here, we have the aperture ring, which you can see there's a little black dot on the top, which indicates your aperture. This is a stepless aperture. There are a lot of people who will call this declicked. It's only called declicked if it had a click to begin with. Apertures that come or were made without any sort of ball bearing to create click stops are called stepless. So this is stepless between f3.5 and f16. So what you want to, and basically as soon as you adjust this ring, the aperture is going to close down. Then of course on the top we have these focusing scales. There's the numbers 3, 5, 5, 6, 8, 11, and 16, coincidentally the same numbers as the aperture. So let's say we're going to set this to f16. Come over here to this f16 and set infinity focus there. Now that's your hyperfocal distance. Everything from this f16 to this f16 will be in focus, which is infinity to 1.75 meters. Okay, well what if we were closer focused? What if we set the 1 meter mark at f16? Well, in that case, everything, and we still have the aperture at f16. In that case, everything from 1 meter up to 2 meters would be in focus. So whatever your focus point is, now let's say we're at f8, and we set 1.7 meters at f8, come over here to f8, everything from 1.7 to 3 meters would be in focus. So the way to read these numbers here is that the numbers on this part of the lens correspond to your aperture. All of the distances between the aperture that you have selected will be in focus. So if we have f5.6 and we set infinity to f5.6, then everything from about 4.5 meters to infinity will be in focus. So understanding that, let's talk about how to take a picture. You can, with this, set it to f16 and your hyperfocal distance, and you're going to be in good shape to take a lot of snapshots. Very easy to do. The basic process, or you can set it to f5.6 or whatever you need to set it at. The basic process of taking a photo with this camera is to find your focus with it wide open, set your aperture to what you want the aperture to be, make sure that your shutter speed is set to what it needs to be for a proper exposure, and take a picture. To determine a proper exposure, you can use a handheld light meter. You could also use a smartphone light meter. However, understand that smartphone light meters have more variability in them than older light meters that are handheld. And the reason for that is because a lot of smartphone makers play free and easy with sensitivity. So what would be considered 100 ISO on my Motorola Z4 may not be the exact same settings at 100 ISO on your Apple or your Pixel phones, or whatever other brand of phone you might have. So just bear in mind that if you are going to use your phone or a phone-based app, you'll want to double check the settings versus the Sunny 16 rule before you trust it. That said, most phone apps are close enough that black and white and color film settings will be forgiving. You'll be within the range of tolerance of black and white and color negative films. So, okay, so you can take your light meter reading. It says you need to be at 1/100th of a second. Okay, we'll set the shutter speed to 1/100th of a second. Make sure that the shutter is armed at f8. So we'll set this to f8. Okay, we know that's there. Let's get our focus. Oops, wrong ring. Get our focus, and okay, whatever is 2.5 meters away is in focus. We'll set this to f8, and there are multiple aperture scales on the front of the lens so that wherever you have it focused, you have one that's convenient to see. And then you take your picture, advance the film, and then keep shooting as you need to throughout the course of your day, adjusting your settings as lighting conditions change. And that's it. That is how you take a picture with this camera. It's very simple, very user-friendly. And because it has a plain matte focusing screen in here, there's nothing in the viewfinder to distract you from what is going to be in the scene. I'm not going to demonstrate the mechanics of it with this camera because it doesn't really like doing it. But what about double exposures? This camera uses the exact same double exposure mechanism as Leica 3 cameras, which is after you take your first picture, you don't advance the film. You use the shutter dial. Actually, I guess I am going to demonstrate it. To rearm the shutter, and then you take your second picture. So this is the mechanism by which you rearm the shutter to take your double exposure. The science behind it is that you need to compensate your exposure settings for a double exposure. So let's say that a proper exposure is 1/100th of a second at f5.6. Okay, if you have your film in the camera and you have your section of film right here that's going to receive that light, 1/100th of a second at f5.6 is going to give it a proper amount of light. If you give it twice as much light as it should have, then what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a negative that is called either thick, dark, or dense. There are three words that mean the same thing, which is that the negative got too much light. The consequence of that is that your negative will be low contrast, and because the darkness, the thickness, reduces contrast. So you'll have a low contrast image that will take longer to print in the darkroom, and it will have added digital noise if you scan it. So you want to try to have a properly exposed image when you make a double exposure. And the way to do that is to cut the amount of light reaching the film for each of the two double exposures in half. So the way that you do that with this camera, we know that 1/100th of a second at f5.6 is our proper exposure. Okay, so we need to cut the amount of light in half. There are two ways to do that, with the aperture or with the shutter speed. Now bear in mind, all of these things are fractions, so take a second. If we need half as much light as 1/100th of a second, what number are we going to set that to? If you guessed 1/200th, you would be correct. Because this is a fraction, 1/200th of a second is half as much time, meaning half as many photons get to the film as 1/100th of a second. We take our first photo, we would then rearm the shutter, and take our second photo, and then advance the film. And because we are rearming the shutter this way, we don't have to do a dead frame after we do the double exposure like we would with many, many other cameras. Okay, there's another way to do it. We could do that with the aperture instead of the shutter speed. If you are at 1/500th of a second for your proper meter reading, and you need to have half as much light, you can't go any faster with this camera. So in that case, we would set this to f8. f8 is one stop smaller than f5.6, which again means half as much light. So you take your first photo, rearm your shutter, take your second photo, advance your film, and you would have taken a successful double exposure. And that's it. That is everything we had to talk about with the Zenit-C, a very small, very sturdy, and very fun to use 35mm film SLR straight from Russia. With love. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.